Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20740 in the name of Graham Day on the Scottish Election Reform Bill at stage 1. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Graham Day to speak to it and move the motion. Minister, please.
Presiding Officer, thank you. I want to begin by thanking the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee for its scrutiny of the bill at stage 1 and for its report. I also want to thank the Local Government and Communities Committee for its valuable contribution to consideration of these issues that we are about to debate. Having heard evidence from a wide range of stakeholders, both committees have welcomed the proposals contained within the bill, although rightly they have sought to explore further some of the aspects of it. And this afternoon's debate, brief as it is, will afford us a chance to do just that. With the Scotland Act 2016 having transferred responsibility for Scottish elections to this Parliament, we have an opportunity to make meaningful and appropriate improvements to how we conduct elections here. Let me address some of the key components of the bill. Firstly, term lengths. We consulted extensively on whether the current 4-year terms for Parliament and local government remain the most appropriate approach. We propose moving both to 5-year terms, which will allow for greater stability in our electoral cycle. I wrote to all members seeking their thoughts last year, and I hope today's debate will help us reach a settled view on this. As a result of clashes with UK general elections, our last 2 sessions have been 5-year terms, and we need to decide what works best in Scotland. Having weighed the options, my own preference is for 5-year terms, and I welcome the support for this from the 2 committees. Changing term lengths will be one of several reforms affecting the Local Government Boundary Commission for Scotland in the bill. As members will be aware, the Commission's remit now includes boundaries for Scottish Parliament elections as well as local government and the areas and the wards related to that. And this change is reflected in a new name, Boundaries Scotland. Under this bill, Boundaries Scotland would have powers to recommend 2- and 5-member local government wards where that fits local circumstances and communities. The bill also allows for rolling boundary reviews, which 71% of respondents to our consultation supported. The current deadline for reviews in the bill reflects a 4-year term at 12 years. In response to the Stage 1 report, I've agreed that the local government review deadlines will be increased to 15 years, providing 5-year terms are adopted. The bill proposes that approval for local government boundary changes will no longer reside with ministers and will now require an affirmative procedure in this Parliament. The role of the Parliament is further expanded through provisions which make the Electoral Commission more directly accountable. The Commission would be funded and be accountable to the Scottish Parliamentary corporate body for the work it carries out in relation to devolved elections. The Commission would also be given powers to create codes of practice covering observers, third parties, candidate expenditure and donation controls. I'm pleased the Electoral Commission welcomes these reforms and the principles behind the bill, and I'm grateful to them for their ongoing engagement. The bill recognises the importance of other key stakeholders in Scottish elections. Expanding the Electoral Management Board's remit to Scottish Parliament elections is reflective of this. Since 2008, the Electoral Management Board has been an invaluable element of elections in Scotland, ensuring that they are delivered to a high standard. The Board assists local authorities in coordinating elections and referendums and promotes best practice through training and information for electoral professionals. This is vital work which strengthens our system and reinforces voter confidence, so I'm pleased the Board will now provide direction for parliamentary elections also. Turning to other provisions, the bill will simplify registration of 14-year-olds. Those approaching legal voting age can already apply to be added to the electoral register as attainers, but the current system is needlessly complex and unclear. Our proposals mean anyone eligible in Scotland who is aged 14 will be able to register as an attainer. It's a small change, but one that makes a big difference to young people's participation, and it has been welcomed by both the committee and our colleagues in the Scottish Youth Parliament. The bill updates existing legislation to enable electronic voting solutions in future. The initial aim is to use technology to support voters with sight loss to vote independently and in secret. After engagement with stakeholders, we are undertaking a limited field trial of electronic ballot delivery to assist those with sight loss. Like the committee, I do not think the time is right for internet voting, but it is important to allow Parliament to explore its options once technology is more established. And to be clear, any pilots of electronic voting solutions proposed by Scottish ministers will be considered by Parliament. The bill creates an offence to vote more than once at local government elections, aligning these with the rules for Scottish Parliament and UK elections. The bill also ensures the existing power of the presiding officer to postpone Scottish Parliament elections operates if Parliament has already been dissolved. This is important to minimise risk to the public during emergencies or unexpected events, and it addresses a gap in the powers of the post holder in this area at present. On a final note, I appreciate the committees have highlighted there are opportunities for further reforms, and I agree. But this bill is a significant step forward in many important areas, although, as I say, by no means the end of the journey. There's also an important point about proper consultation and care when considering reforms. Like the committee, I'm sympathetic to members wanting to tackle the alphabetical bias of the list order effect, but I also agree that options must be carefully researched to avoid disadvantaging voters. We must, for example, respect the needs of those with disabilities and the neurodiversity of the electorate. As the committee report states, and I quote, "There is no point simply replacing one set of problems with another." And that echoed my own comments at the committee evidence session when I said that we should not change simply for change's sake. But that is not a signal for inaction. We need to find a better way forward that does not have obvious drawbacks. I appreciate much of the content of this bill is highly technical. Boundary changes and powers of the Electoral Commission sound quite dry in isolation. But what we're seeing is we should value rigorous independent oversight of our system, and this bill enhances that. The Reform Bill brings in these changes to support stakeholders and reassure the public, building on strong foundations of partnership working and our proposals to widen the franchise. I want to finish as I started by thanking the committees for their engagement, and I look forward to this afternoon's debate. And I move that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I may have missed this. Did you move the motion?
I did.
You did. That's my fault. I now call Bill Kidd on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Convener, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And as convener of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, I am very pleased to speak in this debate on behalf of the committee. The Scottish Elections Reform Bill proposes a number of changes, as has been mentioned, to electoral practice and administration in Scotland. It's a technical bill, but it is also an important one. It's a vital bill in that any changes to our elections in Scotland work effectively and enhance the democratic process. The electoral system needs to be accessible to everyone who has the right to vote. I'm grateful to committee members for working together to produce a unanimous report on the bill. I also acknowledge the experts in the field of running elections who generously gave up their time to inform our scrutiny of the bill. The bill contains a number of different provisions, but I would like to highlight the main conclusions reached by the committee. We heard different views on the relative merits of 4- and 5-year terms for Scottish Parliament and local government elections, and ultimately the committee was satisfied that the balance of evidence supports a move to 5-year terms for both these elections. This schedule will make clashes between elections less frequent, and there is also an argument that a 5-year term will allow more time for policy development. The committee also supported the proposal in the bill to allow 2- and 5-member wards for local government elections. We anticipate that this will be particularly useful in more remote or rural areas. And we did hear some concerns about the impact of 2-member wards on the proportionality between votes cast and wards won. The committee believes 2-member wards should only be recommended in very exceptional circumstances, such as remoter rural areas. And that includes islands also. The committee supports the proposal in the bill to make it an offence to vote more than once at Scottish local government elections held on the same day. This brings local government elections into line with UK and Scottish Parliament elections. However, we were not clear how this provision will be enforced, as there are challenges in cross-referring between electoral registers as they stand. The committee welcomes the approach being proposed by the Scottish Government in relation to electronic voting, as a need to proceed with caution in relation to relatively untested technology. The proposal to undertake pilots is welcome, as is the focus on smaller scale improvements to enhance the accessibility of the voting process, particularly for people with disabilities, as has been mentioned. We suggest the Scottish Government should accelerate this engagement with groups representing disabled people. There were a number of other provisions in the bill which were welcomed by the committee, for example, a simplification of the rules to allow anyone over 14 to register as an attainer before they are officially old enough to vote. The committee also took evidence on some topics which weren't included in the bill. For example, we heard evidence about the list order effect. This is when candidates nearer the top of the ballot paper are more likely to be selected. This is potentially unfair to candidates in elections whose surname is further down the alphabet. There was no consensus on how the list order effect should be addressed. We recommended that the Scottish Government should ask the Electoral Commission to take a wider look at different approaches to ballot design. Another issue highlighted by the committee was the requirement that candidates' addresses appear on ballot papers for local government elections. Yes, of course. Thank you. Yes, certainly.
Richard Lyle.
Consultation put forward proposal for removing the current legal requirement for candidates' addresses to appear in a ballot paper in local government elections. I've actually written to ministers and asked, is it also intended to allow candidates to have their addresses withheld from publication, either on council websites or notice boards on council premises, so as to protect possibly former abused applicants?
Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much. This was discussed also, and thank you very much for raising it again. The fact is that a number of people raised concerns with us about security and safety. This has been a long-term issue with a number of people. The committee was pleased that the Minister has agreed to address this issue as soon as possible, and I'm sure he is sitting here today, he will listen to the wider element that has been mentioned by Mr Lyle, and thank you very much for raising that. The committee also noted that there will continue to be scope to reform the electoral system in the future. For example, there is a need to address the important issue of under-registration. The committee was also supportive of the idea of reviewing the multi-member system for local government elections. To conclude, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Elections Reform Bill proposes a range of changes to electoral law covering Scottish Parliament and local government elections. These proposed changes in the bill have been broadly welcomed on that basis, and the committee was content to recommend to Parliament that the general principles of the bill be agreed to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr Kidd. I now call Adam Tompkins on behalf of the Conservatives. Mr Tompkins.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Broadly, we welcome this bill, and we will be supporting it at stage one this evening. It contains, as we've heard, mainly technical but nonetheless important changes to aspects of electoral law. I want to confine my remarks this afternoon to three areas, in each of which I think there are a number of questions for the Minister to reflect on as the bill progresses, namely parliamentary terms, two-member council wards and electronic voting and voter participation. And my hope is that the Minister will want to engage constructively with us and indeed with members across the Chamber on our concerns about these aspects of the bill as it progresses through the legislative process. So parliamentary terms first. Presiding Officer, this Parliament will sit for a maximum of 5 years, as did the last session of the Scottish Parliament, and this reflects the change at UK level from 4-year sessions being the norm to 5-year sessions, a change that moved from convention to law in the Fixed Term Parliaments Act 2011. Now, speaking personally, Presiding Officer, I regret this change. I prefer 4-year terms to 5-year terms, but that boat would appear to have sailed, although, who knows, it may yet sail back. What is important, of course, here as in all matters of electoral law, is that the interests of the voter are paramount. And what the voter wants, I suspect, is clarity. In this sense, it matters less whether terms are 4 years or 5 years, and it matters more, regardless of whether they're 4 or 5, that the issue is clear and put beyond unnecessary doubt. It also matters, I think, that this session of Parliament should not set its own limits. The length of this session was set before the 2016 election, and the length of the next session should be set now and not after the 2021 election. On these matters, I think that there is no controversy. And so, in principle, I support the move made in sections 1 and 2 of this bill to fix the terms for both this Parliament and for local government in Scotland at 5 years. But there is one fly in the ointment, and this is the matter I would like the Minister to reflect on. If this is all happening, if the reform in sections 1 and 2 of the bill is happening because of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, What will Scottish ministers do when or if that Act is repealed? I suspect that that Act's days are numbered. Most commentators think that it has not worked. After all, we've had now not one but two early general elections since that Act came into force. The fixed terms of the UK Parliament don't seem to be particularly fixed. And of course, the current Conservative government has a manifesto commitment to repeal the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. So my question for the Minister in this aspect of the bill would be this: how does he think that we should reflect this rather fluid picture as we debate and deliberate on Section 1 of this bill? Moving, Presiding Officer, to two-member council wards. As the law stands, all council wards in Scotland have either 3 or 4 councillors. The Islands Scotland Act 2011 allows the creation of 1 or 2 member wards in the islands, and this makes good sense. But Section 4 of the bill would allow the creation of 2, 3, 4 or 5 member wards in any council area in Scotland. Now, the Standards Committee, as we've heard from its convener in its Stage 1 report on this bill, supported this proposal but voiced concerns reflected in the evidence it received that the degree of flexibility envisaged in Section 4 is not an unalloyed good, and indeed comes with some potentially negative consequences which need to be carefully thought about. And I urge the Minister to take these concerns seriously. In particular, the worry is this: 2 member wards may be desirable in some perhaps sparsely populated areas that have strong community boundaries. But, and this is a big but, proportionality between votes cast and seats won is the explicit objective of the single transferable vote system that we now use in Scotland for local government elections. And 2 member wards make the achievement of that proportionality much more difficult than is the case with larger multi-member wards. Surely we do not want the new flexibility, which, let me just finish the point, and I'll certainly let Mr Finlay in if I have time, Presiding Officer. Surely we do not want the new flexibility which Section 4 of the bill heralds to undermine that all-important principle of proportionality.
Neil Finlay, and there is time for interventions.
I agree very much with what he's saying, but we took evidence on the committee from one academic who was arguing for very large wards indeed in order to ensure proportionality and choice. I'm just wondering what Mr Tompkins' view on that is. I certainly would not like to see wards of 8 or 10 or anything like that.
Adam Tompkins.
Very odd day in the Scottish Parliament, Presiding Officer, because not only does Mr Finlay agree with me, but I agree with Mr Finlay. I would like to see, on this matter, we must therefore both be wrong. I would like to see the norm being 4 or 5 member wards as it is, 3 or 4 member wards as they are at the moment, and only exceptionally for wards to be either smaller than that or larger than that. The Standards Committee has noted what it calls its disappointment that the Scottish Government did not commission more research into the matter of the proportionality of 2 member wards, and recommends that 2 member wards should be used only in what the committee has called very exceptional circumstances. I agree with this recommendation, and can I ask the Minister if he and his officials would commit to work with me, and indeed with other members who are interested in this matter, to craft an amendment to the bill for Stage 2 to ensure that overuse of 2 member wards is not permitted and is not allowed to undercut the principle of proportionality on which our local government elections in Scotland is based. Finally, Presiding Officer, electronic voting and voter participation. Now, I'm sure that we all share the view that we want to do what we can to encourage voting. High voter turnouts in elections are better for everyone who believes in the democratic process than low voter turnouts. That said, however, some of the more frequently made suggestions as to how voter turnout may be encouraged need to be treated with caution. Moving from Thursday elections to Friday or weekend elections would have grave implications for a number of religious groups, for example, and should, in my view, be resisted for that reason. Likewise, moving to electronic voting. This may have considerable benefits, not least for those who find access to polling stations a physical challenge, whether it's for reasons of sight or for other physical disabilities. But other European countries with experience of electronic voting report serious concerns about security. Researchers have found the Swiss system to be flawed. The Estonian system has likewise been said to be outdated and open to attack. And in Finland, the view has been taken that the security of online voting is not yet advanced enough to ensure either the confidentiality or the integrity of the voting system. Now, the bill does not enable electronic voting, but in Section 6 it does enable pilot projects, as the Minister explained, that may include some form of electronic voting. The Standards Committee describes this light touch approach to be probably the most appropriate approach, and I cautiously agree. There is a need to proceed, I think, with great caution, given the very real concerns about security which have been voiced across Europe. Yet, at the same time, consideration does need to be given to the accessibility of polling stations, as I've already said. So while cautiously welcoming Section 6 of the bill, could I ask the Minister to specify how he proposes to ensure that any pilots exploring the use of electronic voting in Scotland will ensure that the integrity of our voting system is not compromised by untested technology? Overall, Presiding Officer, we are supportive of this bill at stage 1, but we look forward to working with the Government and indeed with members across the Chamber on amendments to it that address concerns such as those that I've outlined here.
Thank you very much. Now call Neil Findlay to open for Labour. Mr Findlay.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. And can I first of all thank the committee members, the convener and the clerks who have been helping us through this bill. We've had some very interesting sessions. I suppose this is not the most exciting bill to come before this Parliament. Certainly not the most exciting thing that's happened today. I would say it's been a very lively day in Parliament, but it is very important to our democracy, this bill. The way we organise elections is vital to ensuring that the widest number of people can participate in our elections and that those elections are fair, people have confidence in them and they are seen to be fair, which is very important. If we look at different electoral systems and how they work, how different methods of voting deliver results or sometimes don't deliver results, and all the nuts and bolts of elections, then we know this is an area of huge importance with very significant consequences for our country and our people, because when elections go badly wrong, then they can really go badly wrong. We only need to look at the shambolic chaos of the Iowa primary to see that, or the hanging chads in Florida, where the country that's supposed to be the leader of the free world and a beacon of democracy ended up in chaos with all sorts of, with an ageing system, a creaking system at the heart of the problem, I suppose sprinkled with a liberal sprinkling of corruption. Closer to home, we had the 2007 election shambles that we had here. So, watching that over the world can be painful, but we shouldn't just point the fingers at others when we get it wrong. We have to keep our democracy match fit, and I think some of the points in this bill seek to do that. Also seek to increase participation in our democracy, and that is a key thing. I think that all of us, irrespective of our political view, want to see the maximum number of people participate in our democracy. There were, of course, mixed views on term lengths, and I think Mr Tompkins was quite clear. His view probably is different maybe from some within his party, and my own party people had different views, and I'm sure that's the same with the ministers. It actually reflects some of the research that was done that came before the committee. There's no firm view on that, but on the balance, the Labour Party supports 5-year terms. We also accept that in some circumstances 2 or 5 member wards may be required for local council elections to meet particular local circumstances, and I think all of us were clear at the committee that that should only be used by exception. It shouldn't be the norm. We don't accept the arguments, as I mentioned earlier, that some of the witnesses put forward for huge wards and the pitch that was put across that there would be some sort of arrangement between the 10 or 8 or however many members, and they'd all get on very well and they'd all produce the goods, when actually they're more likely to be fighting like ferrets in a sack, if we're honest. So I think those big wards, I don't think that would work, and just in order to produce proportionality. I think we have to ensure that local connections and geography and communities are respected and not dispensed with just for an arithmetical formula. And I was, Mr Tompkins saying that he was a bit aghast that he agreed with me. I'm sure Mr Tompkins, who was once a disciple of a Mr T Sheridan, can find time in his heart to have some common common linkage with a woolly Liberal like me. So it's good to hear Mr Tompkins agreeing with me for once. One area where the committee had a great deal of debate and showed interest in was in the list order effect, where those with an a name that's alphabetically higher up on the ballot paper gain an advantage. We all know people who've gone to great lengths to change their name to Andy Aardvark or whatever to get that advantage. Indeed, during the deliberations of the committee, I recall Alex Salmond for First Minister. Who remembers that? Exactly, using and exploiting the list order effect. And I have to say, the SNP were quite right to do it. They were quite right to do it. They saw an advantage in doing it. But that list order effect does disadvantage people. There is an inbuilt advantage for those higher up the ballot paper. So I'll ask the Minister this, and he can reply and sum it up, if he will commit to proper, decent quality, in-depth research into how we address that. I think the issue has to be full randomisation, but that's only my personal view. On electronic voting, if I've got some time, I'm open-minded about electronic voting. The committee was very cautious on it, and I understand, and I'm cautious on it myself. I have to say, and I know this will, and Mr Tompkins will enjoy this, that the one electronic voting system that I have looked at up close was actually the Venezuelan electronic voting system. I was there as an election observer in 2012, I think it was. And what was interesting from that election was a hotly disputed election. It was down to less than 1% between the candidates. And we saw the electoral system operating there. Highly sophisticated, electronic, with 17 audits within the system. And the Jimmy Carter Foundation examined that system and said it was the best voting system in the world. Very interesting. And there was a full manual recount of the system because it was so close. And the manual recount replicated almost exactly the electronic ballot. So there are countries across the world that we might want to learn from that you may not initially in the first instance think would be the countries that we want to learn from. Finally, I would say one thing, Presiding Officer, I think we should look much more closely at all postal ballots in some elections, because I think that is the most successful way to engage as many people as possible.
Thank you very much. I now call Mark Ruskell to open the Green Party. Mr Ruskell, please. I'll be generous with you as well.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I join other members in thanking the clerks and all those who gave evidence and other members of the committee in considering this bill. I mean, welcome this bill. I guess it represents a baby step towards democratic reform, and we welcome its general principles, but to be honest, it's hardly groundbreaking stuff, and I think even when taken together with a franchise bill, we've still got miles to go if we're to reinvigorate democracy, improve registration and turnout, and make Holyrood and council chambers truly representative of the people that they serve. Now, last year I went with the presiding officer to visit the Swedish Parliament, and there was genuine concern there that turnout in elections had fallen just a few percentage points from the high 90s. But, you know, these are levels of voter participation that we could only dream about in elections in Scotland. And we still live in one of the most democratically underrepresented countries in Europe in terms of both the levels of government that operate and the numbers of elected representatives that serve in those governments. So an example, in Sweden, 1 out of every 145 citizens has actually stood for an election, whereas in Scotland it's 1 in every 2,000. In Sweden, political work is normalised in communities, and I think it really shows in their political culture. So does this bill address that democratic deficit? I don't think it does. It makes a small step, but it doesn't really address it. And I welcome, for example, the 5-member council wards now being an option for the Local Government Boundary Commission to consider. You know, that would deliver more proportionality. But to represent what the public actually vote for in an election, we would need wards that were around the 6 to 7 member mark. I mean, we did, to answer Mr Finley's question, that we did take some evidence on that. There was some more expansive evidence suggesting you could have kind of city-wide lists, council-wide lists. But I think even sticking with the system that we have at the moment, expanding it to true proportionality would require 6 to 7 members. But worryingly, and I share Mr Tompkins' views on this, the option of 2-member wards is also on the table in the bill, and beyond the islands, where flexibility for 1- and 2-member wards already exists, I really can't see any circumstances where 2-member wards would actually be appropriate. I mean, the fact that the government didn't do any work to consider the impact on proportionality of the bill is really disappointing. But I do hope that 13 years after the introduction of the new local government system, that a wider review of that multi-member ward system can now take place. And it would be good if the Minister could perhaps reflect on when that can take place. Because I think in the committee, you know, we all had perhaps different perceptions of how well that multi-member system has worked. But I think now is a good time to actually review that. I felt as a committee sometimes we disappeared down a few rabbit holes sometimes in evidence. I mean, one was a list order effect, and you know, I don't deny it may be real, especially for candidates of the same party whose surnames start with the same letter. But I think it's clear that a wide range of other factors are more important, particularly for local government elections, especially incumbency. Another red herring I feel was around registration. The bill makes it illegal to vote more than once, and I suspect that most people would think that that was already the law and might be surprised to learn that it's not. But registration on multiple registers I don't think is a problem, because groups such as students move around, and it's far more important that they're enfranchised to vote where they're resident at the time of the election rather than having no vote whatsoever. Under-registration, I feel, is a much bigger issue that should concern us. The shift in the length of parliamentary terms from 4 to 5 years, again, is to be welcomed. There's no point in trying to second-guess the chaos of Westminster timetabling anymore, and 5 years allows parliaments to get much more into their stride. On electronic voting, to be honest, I think we receive very little evidence on this, which I'm a bit disappointed about, but I am aware of major concerns from organisations, including the Open Rights Group, about whether e-voting can ever be genuinely secure, anonymous and verifiable. Government appears to be quite agnostic on electronic voting, but I would ask the Minister to focus work with disability groups on other methods of increasing participation, including postal voting. And I would also ask that government works with Open Rights and others in fully assessing the implications of any pilot well before they're even considered. Finally, Presiding Officer, the provisions in the bill to allow attainers of age 14 to be entered onto the electoral register, I think could be a real springboard to help young people play a full role in democratic life. And I do urge the government to help equip our young people with the knowledge they need about our democracy while they await their full rights to vote to come to fruition. This is an unusually exciting provision in a bill that's been perhaps more about tidying up than igniting a renewed democratic vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I call on Willie Rennie for the Liberal Democrats. Mr Rennie, please.
I don't know what Neil Findlay's talking about. This is the stuff that Liberal Democrats love to talk about. As a former election agent myself, I would spend hours and hours discussing the detail of member-sized wards. How many would you have? Would it be 2, 5, 6, 7? That kind of stuff. I could last forever. Conferences would be spent forever talking about this, probably along with Neil Findlay.
Pardon, I wasn't looking. Mr Findlay, my apologies.
Being a Liberal Democrat, that's the least surprising thing I've ever heard.
Willie Rennie.
We might have one of those discussions ourselves, Neil Findlay. I might inflict that upon you. But actually, from memory, back in Adam Tompkins objecting to that somehow, I remember back in the coalition, the Liberal Democrat Labour coalition of 1999 to 2007, there was obviously, when we brought the proportional representation system in for local councils, there was a debate, and Sarah Boyack might remember this, as to the size of the wards. And in the end, I think we came up with the compromise. We wanted bigger size wards. We did want to reflect that in rural areas, some of the distances are utterly huge. I mean, when you go up to Caithness, the size of the wards up there are enormous. They're much bigger than many of our constituencies. So there was a debate at that time, and we compromised on 3 and 4 member wards. So having 2 and 5, I think, would help in terms of keeping communities together in more urban areas, increasing the amount of proportionality in urban areas as well, but then reflecting in rural areas the real distances involved and the sheer number of community councils sometimes that are involved in those communities as well as parent councils at schools. So I think all of that, I think, is sensible to do 2 and 5. I would probably change it a little bit further and go to bigger size wards. And we know in islands there is potential to go to 1-member wards, which I think is equally sensible as well. We also support the kind of cautious approach on electronic pilots, particularly around about sight loss. I think that's a sensible way to proceed. I do think we need to be careful with our democracy, that we don't try out some of the measures that are being proposed by some that may actually jeopardise the whole electoral system. So I'd be cautious on electronic pilots. I think we need to be careful. I do think it's sensible to have declarations on internet adverts. We've seen that Facebook has changed some of that to give greater transparency, certainly through Facebook, but there needs to be on other adverts as well some ability to find out who the original source was of the advert itself, so we can track back and hold to account for anything that is said. The Electoral Commission being accountable to the Parliament, in fact specifically the corporate body of this Parliament, and considering the debate that we had quite recently on the independence of the corporate body, I think we do need to be careful with that institution. Also, the Electoral Commission reporting to that gives it added importance to make sure that as an independent body that is considered as such in this Parliament. So all of that I agree with. I even agreed with Neil Findlay in terms of doing further research on the randomisation of ballots. I do recall Stephen Purcell in Glasgow, when he was the leader of Glasgow City Council, almost losing his seat in Glasgow because they happened to be a little bit further down the ballot paper. Now, I'm not sure the members or the constituents in his ward really intended for that to happen, but that almost did what happened. So we need to be mindful of that, and I think we should have further research into this, because I think there is a bias towards those at the top of the alphabet, and somebody who is at the bottom of the alphabet, like me, has got a great interest in making that change. We do not support, however, the 5-year term lengths. The norm has been, for a long time, 4 years. In my view, there is no reason why we should change from 4 years. We should go back to 4 years, because that gives a renewal of our democracy on a regular basis, sufficiently long terms in government, but also enough democracy within our system. Because as we've seen, politics changes an awful lot in our country, and I think the electors should have the right to be able to change their governments on a more frequent basis than 5 years. And I know it feels like we've had elections and referendums almost every 5 minutes for the last decade, but that hopefully is not always going to be the case. So actually having a 4-year cycle, I think, would be sensible. And as Adam Tompkins has alluded to, it might not be the case that we continue with the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. And we might be back in the same position again of having to make sure that we separate the elections by some other means. So I think we should do what's right for our democracy up here and have 4-year terms instead of the 5-year terms. We do want to avoid a repeat of 2007 and the chaos around about that time. But we can do that by making sure we have a system in this Parliament that accommodates any change at Westminster. I do hope the next elections reform bill is much more radical, however, and I do wish there is another election reform bill so I can make another speech on this subject. We could have a reform to the voting system in this Parliament. We could have it to be aligned with local government voting system so we can have single transferable vote across the country. And that would allow us no confusion. It would allow us to be able to educate people fully in terms of the ballot paper. And even with randomised ballot papers, we would have a connection with the communities, but greater proportionality. We would have simplicity as well. So I would urge the Minister to consider that for the next elections bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And moving on to open debate, I can give the open debate speakers 5 minutes each. So I call Gil Patterson, followed by Tom Mason. Mr Patterson.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Like Neil Findlay and others across the Chamber, to men at face value, the Scottish Elections Reform Bill might seem a bit dry and a bit technical, but the changes proposed to our election arrangements, in my opinion, are very sensible and will enhance democracy. By increasing the Scottish parliamentary and local government elections to 5-year term will ensure that there will be no election clashes in the future and we can avoid the confusion of 2007 when we had a very different elections on the same day. I'm very much a believer that every election we have in Scotland should have its own focus and uniqueness, and we should provide the best circumstances for voters to concentrate on specific issues raised at that election. In 2007, I believe that local government was detrimental to them and their message and the work that they had been undertaking, and folk trying to get re-elected, that it muddied the water. The proposals in relation to changing council board membership by introducing 1, 2 and 5 member wards to the current 3 or 4 councillor wards is quite a significant adjustment, and as we can see, it will certainly have some detractors. But by allowing local circumstance, and I think this is the key to this part, because I understand you can hear the differences between people's opinion in this, but the key part of this having people who are there making that decision is the right one. The fact that 72% of those who responded to the consultation agree that local circumstances and geography should be given more weight when deciding ward sizes, and that's the way I see it too, confirmed my view, and that is the right way to go. Certainly the principle of one member, one vote, rather than come early, vote early, and vote often is not mine. But the principle of one person, one vote included in the bill with regard to local government voters' registration in 2 council areas is undoubtedly an improvement to the current situation and is supported by 93% of the Scottish Government consultation responders. By introducing the subject of electronic voting provision will give us the opportunity to investigate the practicalities of providing better voting access for those who find it hard to participate in the process. And for me, that's where it might actually end because of the worries about folk hacking into the system. So having said that, I'm pleased on the back of other countries' negative experiences with electronic voting and the potential cyber attacks from out with, we will require further legislation before any pilot or trial scheme can be implemented. By registering attainer voters at age 14 and over without the complication of assessing a year and a notional age is a step forward and will make the registration process simpler for everyone. But more importantly for me, it will encourage young people, young attainers, voters to register early and to participate in the democratic process, not just for the here and now, but I think that in itself will introduce people early and be good for democracy and voting intentions in the long run. Currently, there's no requirements for candidates in council elections to disclose where financial donations to their campaign have come from. In the name of transparency and fairness, I, like most of the consultation respondents, agree that this situation should change, and this bill makes the provision for that. When it comes to the way that the list system works, I believe it discriminates against those that have names late in the alphabet, and some of the evidence that we received, in fact, all of the evidence that we received pointed to that if you were further down the list, just with that mere fact, then it was detrimental to you. So I'm really pleased that the government is prepared to look at that, and let's hope, and I think we can sort that out. However, all in all, the Scottish Elections Reform Bill makes sensible adjustments to our electoral process and I believe improve democracy in Scotland, and that's what it should be all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Patterson. I call Tom Mason, followed by Sarah Boyack. Mr Mason, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as elements of this bill relate to local government, I declare an interest as an Aberdeen City Councillor. The Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee has been pleased to provide scrutiny of this bill, and I'm grateful to the Minister for his response to our recommendations in Stage 1 report. Broadly, the bill seeks to make changes to the electoral law, mostly to reform aspects of practice for local government elections, as well as touching on term lengths of this Parliament and some facilitating arrangements for trials in electronic voting, among other things. I welcome making permanent the change to 5-year terms for the Scottish Parliament, as this will provide both certainty and sufficient time for the government of the day to progress its policy objectives. I support the move to enable the Local Government Boundary Commission to bring forward 2- and 5-year 5-member wards where appropriate, although I hope that more is done on assessing the effects these would have on proportionality of votes cast as elections in wards 1. As far as electronic voting goes, I'm generally supportive of examining if it would boost political engagement. However, I do think that we should be very careful as any action we take should have validity of electoral results as a first priority. However, I would advocate that we work towards electronic counting, which has always struck me as being rather absurd, sitting there counting by hand when we have an electronic machine to do it for us. Now, I wish to focus the remainder of my remarks on a few areas where there appears to be a difference in approach set out in the report compared with thinking of the Scottish Government. I know that the Government has supported the majority of the recommendations set out, and I am glad ministers will prepare relevant amendments for Stage 2. However, there appears to be alternative viewpoints on a couple of issues. These are not areas of huge disagreement, but simply where further reflection will be required. One committee recommendation asked for further consideration being given to the effect of postal ballots on turnout. But it appears from ministers' letters the government is hesitant to commit to such work. I hope the minister will reconsider this, as postal votes are a valuable aspect of our electoral system. And if it would boost engagement, then it is something we should look at again. In addition, I'm glad the Minister has agreed to further consideration of increasing the maximum fines for breaching electoral expenditure rules. This move would ensure welcome consistency with the Referendums Act. One element that was discussed in committee, but not included in the bill, was a review of multi-member wards in order to improve electoral practice and administration. The Scottish Government has stated that there is not sufficient time in this parliamentary session to consider this issue in depth. I accept that this is a fair assessment. However, given my first-hand experience in the matter, I feel I should implore those who are here after the next election to make this a priority so that Parliament does all it can to make sure local government is working as efficiently and effectively as possible. In particular, proportionality should be examined. We know this improves with higher councillors' numbers per ward. But following that through to its natural conclusion would mean wards being replaced with an area-wide PR list, which would not help public interact with their representatives. Perhaps a solution will be found based on the electoral system for this Parliament, giving both ward and authority-wide mandates that more accurately reflect the electorate's views. Presiding Officer, this bill has a couple of issues that may require amending in further stages. However, I endorse the conclusion of the Stage 1 report that the changes are broadly acceptable. With this in mind, I'm happy for the bill to proceed and will vote accordingly later today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Mason. I call Sarah Boyd, to be followed by Annabel Ewing. Ms Ewing is the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Boyd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, like colleagues in the Chamber, I think this bill represents a welcome opportunity to look at how we can improve our electoral process. And as was stated in the Electoral Reform Society's evidence to the Local Government and Communities Committee, meaningful and more inclusive participation should absolutely be the cornerstone of electoral reform. And in their evidence, they also highlighted that they thought that the reforms in front of us are not in any way enough to achieve a democracy fit for the 21st century, and pressed that any amendment to the electoral system made through the bill must again be reviewed when the outcome of the local governance review comes before Parliament. And that's not to speak against the bill, but to say we should also view this bill in a wider context. And these are modest changes we're making today. The Labour Party will support the general prince of the bill, and I think there are a couple of things we'd welcome for example, the cap on spending in local government elections, action on online advertising, and particularly bringing Scotland into line with the rest of the UK on that issue. But also, I think, it's been mentioned by several people, to allow those aged 14 and over to join the electoral register. And I think that has to be backed up with increased work in our schools to make sure that young people are aware of local government and how it interacts in their lives. I think when this Parliament was set up, there was a huge effort, and I think as continued, those of us who've had school visits will know that there is an interaction, that teachers are interested in what we do, and that young people are engaged. The challenge is getting that engagement in school to be real engagement, and for young people to feel they want to get active, to vote, and potentially stand as candidates as well. So hopefully those changes will be important in terms of improving voter turnout amongst young people if it's followed through with education. And I think these changes could serve as example for UK elections as well. I said we've got some reservations towards the bill, and it's something that quite a few members have mentioned today, the issue about electronic voting. I think there's a real issue. Colleagues have quoted problems across Europe and the fact that it doesn't actually increase participation. The problems in the US have been mentioned, and one of the things is that electronic voting can be problematic and it can cause staffing issues in polling stations. There were 1 or 2 parts of Europe that were mentioned where electronic voting doesn't work. I think the example of Belgium, where you've got compulsory voting, but after the introduction of electronic voting in Belgium, voting numbers actually dropped. So I think it's something we really need to look at in a bit more depth, and I think stage 2 could be a good opportunity for that. While we do want to modernise the process of voting, I think there's an issue about the integrity of the process, which is absolutely paramount. It's potentially going to make it more streamlined if we've got electronic voting, but if we look at big organisations like banks and financial institutions, with all the budgets they've got, they are not safe from cyber attacks. So I think it's something we've really got to flag as a concern, that this potentially leads to issues. I think the comments made by both Neil Findlay and Mark Ruskell about postal ballots are something that's worth looking at in terms of encouraging people to get involved. Another area that's been discussed this afternoon is the issue of the size of is the issue of numbers of councillors in council wards and the concern about underrepresentation. And one thing that's not been mentioned so far is that we are actually one of the most underrepresented countries in the world. We've only got 1 elected representative for every 4,270 people. Now, on one level, moving to 2- and 5-member wards does give flexibility, and it's been welcomed by some. But I think the comments today... yes, briefly?
Tom Mason.
Not the case that up till very recently, being in the European Union, we had 19 representatives for each member of the Scottish community.
Sarah Boyack.
But compared with the rest of the EU, in terms of local representation, we don't have the same level of representation. So I think everybody's been focusing on the proportionality issue, which I totally agree with. There's something also about the capacity of councillors to represent people in what can be incredibly large wards. And in island communities and remote rural communities, that is clearly an issue. So there's also an issue about, could you have more councillors in our communities, rather than just focusing on the number of wards in terms of proportionality. I think bringing those two things together might be another way to look at it. I did feel it was interesting to hear the reservations from Bill Kidd and colleagues in the Standards Committee, because those discussions actually paralleled the reservations that came up in our Local Government Committee when we looked at this issue. Finally, I just want to talk about representation. I think that alongside this bill, we've talked about encouraging young people to vote. There's something more broadly about encouraging everybody to vote. The numbers we have in terms of participation in local government elections are very low, not just compared with ourselves, but the UK elections. There's something about encouraging people to get involved in local elections and local government. So I think when we're looking at the issue of the size of wards and the numbers of people standing in wards, we should be thinking about participation and encouraging people to get involved. And when you look at the amount of representation and the parity between men and women in Scotland, we've only got 30.5% of our representatives in local government. And that's something we should be looking to improve as well. It's not good enough. So let's look at this bill, get the details right in it, but also use the opportunity of having the debate around this bill to encourage the greater involvement of young people in voting, think about how we encourage the participation of young people and underrepresented groups to become candidates and potentially become elected representatives. There's an opportunity in this bill. While the bill cannot do everything, one thing I would ask the ministers to think about is have a look at the review. Have a look at multi-member wards. It's been mentioned by a couple of members, and do a proper review about how they've worked and the range of changes we could make to increase representation.
Thank you very much. I now call on Annabel Ewing, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to have been called to speak in this Stage 1 debate on the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. And as we know, this bill is part of a package of measures intended to update our electoral processes alongside, of course, the related but distinct bill being the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill. And I think it's probably fair to say that the latter bill, the Franchise and Representation Bill, dealing with issues of franchise and so forth, has perhaps attracted a wee bit more attention than the, as has been described, drier provisions perhaps of this bill. But the reforms proposed are nonetheless important ones. As we have heard, the bill covers a number of key technical issues that underpin our electoral processes. First, it is indeed proposed in the bill, but I understand the government's position on this is still perhaps unclear, but the Minister can clarify, that we move to a 5-year electoral cycle for both Scottish Parliament and local government, and that would be moving away from the statutory position at present of 4 years. I have heard what members have said on this. Not everybody is in agreement. I think it is entirely reasonable to move to 5 years. And I believe it would help to facilitate longer-term policy planning and, importantly, hopefully greater consultation. The bill will also provide the Boundary Commission with the necessary discretion, as we have heard, to establish 2 or 5-member local government wards where special local circumstances pertain. And again, I have heard the debate this afternoon that that discretion should be exercised very carefully indeed to ensure that we do not risk unduly proportionality issues. Of course, the view has also been expressed that there is a risk of a 2-member ward in terms of perhaps resilience. For example, if one of the 2 councillors becomes ill or otherwise incapacitated. But I think in broad brush, a possibility of a 2-member ward is important in order to reflect the diversity of Scotland and to underline the important fact, I think has been referred to in this afternoon's debate, that one size does not indeed fit all. The bill also sets forth a series of proposals that would amend the way in which the Electoral Commission carries out its work. Also provisions that would extend the role of the Electoral Management Board to cover Scottish parliamentary elections. Also provisions on rules on election expenses returns and on the important issue of donations for local government elections. And also provisions, indeed, that would provide enabling powers to carry out exploratory trials or pilots as far as local government elections are concerned on the issue of electronic voting. And I think there is to be a further debate on electronic voting. I think there are many potential positives, but an awful lot of issues that would be required to be addressed in detail to provide voters with the assurance that their vote was secure and was to be fairly counted. I don't think we are there yet by any stretch of the imagination, but I do welcome the possibility of moving to this exploratory trial to look at improving the accessibility of voting for people with disabilities. Presiding Officer, in addition to the work of the lead committee on this bill, being the Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, my own committee, the Local Government Committee and Communities Committee, also looked at the bill, and we held one evidence session with Ronnie Hines of the Local Government Boundary Commission, as it is currently called, and Jonathan Shaffey of the Electoral Reform Society. And we had a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion with them, both on matters covered directly by the bill and indeed on wider issues but related to the subject matter of the bill. As far as the bill itself is concerned, I am indeed pleased to note that the Minister has responded positively to the recommendation made, including by our committee, following on from the evidence received by, for example, Ronnie Hines, that we moved, in fact, to 15-year cycles for local government boundary reviews. As far as some of the wider issues are concerned, we also held an interesting discussion on the important issue of council by-elections. At present, those take place effectively on the alternative vote method, given that there is normally only one seat vacancy to be filled. And of course, this is far from ideal. The Local Government Committee has suggested that this issue would merit further consideration, and I note that the Minister, in his reply to the letter from the convener of the Local Government and Communities Committee, has indicated a willingness to engage in further discussions on possible reforms here, and I look forward to those discussions. Another wider issue, of course, that has been referred to this afternoon, again, an issue that our committee would welcome further engagement on, is a look at the system of multi-member wards. Indeed, it's been 15 years or so since the passing of the relevant legislation introducing this system, and it may now be that we move at some point in the not too distant future to a review of that system. But aside from those few comments, Presiding Officer, I am very pleased indeed, in conclusion, to support the principles of the bill at stage 1. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Closing speeches. I call on Neil Finlay to close for Labour. 5 minutes, Mr Finlay.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I think Gil Parkson made a very important point at the very beginning of this about the desire to see each election having its own focus, and I think that's right. When elections were coupled together, local government, as is always the case with local government, gets shoved down the agenda, and it shouldn't be like that. Some of the issues raised in the debate are very interesting. Adam Tompkins was right about voters needing clarity and certainty in any elections. I think that is absolutely the case. Where there is uncertainty, it undermines the whole democratic process. And that point about no parliament setting its own term, I think, is equally important. That should never happen. And you know, I think raising that question about the what would happen to this bill and any future bill that may come forward would have to reflect this, is if that Fixed Term Parliament Act was repealed. I think who knows what the situation would be then, and it would be interesting to hear what the Minister's response is to that. We've had quite a lot of comment on the 4- and 5-year terms, and I think it just reflects the divisions that there are, or the differences of opinion that there is between people. Maybe a 4.5-year term is the answer, who knows. And on 2- and 5-member wards, you know, again, there's a number of views, and Willie Rennie, I can see him in Mastermind, the specialist subject, is size of wards, and I could just I could see Willie Rennie at the Liberal Democrat conference, him and Alec Cole-Hamilton with their Lib Dem onesies on, up all night with their peppermint tea, discussing the intricacies of ward sizes. Meanwhile, MacArthur and Tavish Scott would probably hodden up the bar at that time. I'm not quite sure where Mike Rumbles would be, probably locked outside so that he can't influence anybody, but I could just see Willie Rennie in that position. Richard Lyle was quite right to raise the issue of candidate addresses. I think there's a balance to be struck between openness and transparency, but also personal security, and I don't know how that balance should fall, but I think it's a very legitimate question. Sir.
Richard Lyle.
Pressing my button. The point I was making, that I know of one candidate who was formerly abused by her husband and was distraught when her new address, was published by the council.
Neil Finlay.
I think that's the unintended consequence of that things like that can happen that maybe we wouldn't first think about. So it's a very legitimate point to raise. I think it was Tom Mason who raised the point about us being represented by 19 people at one point when we had all the MEPs. The only thing I could say to that is I can never get my head around the fact that one of them at one point was David Coburn. Registering to vote only once, prior to us going into this, I didn't even know you could do that. So every day is a school day on the committee, and I think there are issues about there's practical issues about how we address that and how we make that ensure that that's not abused. Sarah Boyack raised some excellent points about voter education and engagement. I think this is a key point. I know when I was in West Lothian Council, we had an excellent voter education team that did a lot of work out in the community and shopping centres and schools and all the rest of it to sign up people to vote. All of those services have gone. All of those services that were there, they were working at that round, you know, not just at election time. They did that regularly throughout the year. They were very skilled at it. And in the call of local government cuts, many of these services have been dismantled, and I think we're the poorer for it. Local government should be the building block of our democracy, and I think very often it's undervalued, underrated, and very much councillors underpaid. And electronic voting, Graham Day says the Parliament should have its say in its view, and I think that's right. But I think there are issues around cost, practicalities. I can just see another public sector IT project in my mind and sends a shiver up my back. But I think if we're going to move to that, then we would have to move with real caution. But I particularly am open-minded on that. And finally, all of this is about widening access to voting and our democracy. And hopefully we will be able to develop some of this as the bill goes through its parliamentary process.
Thank you very much, Mr Finlay. And I call on Jamie Halker-Johnson, close to the Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Halker-Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Firstly, can I give my regular thanks to our committee clerking team for their support in the preparation of this Stage 1 report that we're debating. And also to the members and clerks of the DPLR committee for their contribution to the process. The bill before us is wide-ranging, and I feel our committee has contributed a considerable body of detailed work on each of the topics. Our convener, Bill Kidd, has already provided an overview of the committee's positions and the support that we have outlined for the principles of the bill at this stage. So in my remarks today, I'd like to address just a few of the issues that continue to arise. On term length, it seems apparent to me that we have gone too long without answering the questions that arise from initially the Fixed Term Parliament Act, but also the broader trend towards 5-year legislative sessions. The Welsh and Northern Ireland assemblies have already broadly accepted this principle. It is, of course, rendered slightly problematic by the fact that, as others have highlighted, we've lived through 3 general elections at UK level in the last 5 years. And to avoid election clashes, the reality is simply that a level of flexibility will be required. The bill also contains provisions relating to postponing elections to this Parliament, and the committee weighed the relative benefits of, firstly, being able to respond to unforeseen consequences against, secondly, the breadth of the power being given to the presiding officer. Again, a degree of flexibility is required. However, we should also be wary of pulling the presiding officer into areas of potential controversy, particularly in situations where there could be heightened tensions during an election campaign, and also at a time when the presiding officer themselves may be seeking re-election in their own constituency. An issue of more local relevance as a Highlands and Islands MSP to me in the provisions around council wards. Coming from the islands where special rules are already in place, it's clear to me that this proposal has some merit in our remote and rural communities. Local government should reflect local needs rather than be a one-size-fits-all approach. Deviation should be possible where there is strong and considered arguments in its favour. When multi-member wards were introduced, often spanning several communities, the link between place and representation became weaker. A reformed approach at community council level could have gone some way towards addressing these issues, but that has not happened. However, as the committee considered in its conclusions, there is a lack of evidence presented by the Scottish Government on the effects of 2-member wards on proportionality. The committee has also considered the provisions in relation to voting in more than one local authority election on the same day. As we've set out, without changes to registration arrangements, it remains difficult to see how such a law will be enforced effectively. The committee has not taken a position on the way forward in this regard, but has at least set out its thinking, while the Scottish Government has ruled out a single register approach. We've had several discussions in this chamber on the question of electronic voting. For regions like my own, there are clear benefits, but also clear disadvantages to the potential approaches that have been suggested here. The Scottish Government has recognised that work in this area is at an early stage, and that is welcome, and I would encourage the ability for a fuller debate in this Parliament before any significant change in policy was set in motion. Finally, I'd like to touch briefly on the powers of the Electoral Commission. The committee has looked at consistency with referendums and the different levels of penalty available to the Electoral Commission when election or referendum laws are breached. The Scottish Government has outlined in its response a sympathy to these arguments and an intention to clarify potential ways forward, and that is a positive approach. Another area of consistency between elections and referendums lies in relation to the Electoral Commission's investigatory powers. It is my view that these should be the same for both of these electoral events. The Scottish Government has quite reasonably set out the reservations that apply in these areas, but if parity of approach is broadly accepted, then there's surely scope for raising the issue with the UK Government and exploring these issues in a cooperative spirit. Earlier, my colleague Adam Tompkins highlighted our support in principle for the bill, but also the need to provide a clarity for voters, particularly around term lengths. He also, as I've done, raised the concerns about the impact of proportionality of the power for smaller two-member wards, an area our committee has also had concerns. Tom Mason also highlighted concerns about the effect of two-member wards on proportionality, and also referred to his own experiences as a councillor and how the proposed changes may impact on local communities. And there were other positive contributions from various members. Neil Findlay and Adam Tompkins surprised each other by finding areas of agreement today. Willie Rennie surprised no one by highlighting just how excited the Lib Dems can get about this sort of thing. And Adam Tompkins also spoke about the security of electronic voting. I do still have concerns about this security of the voting process, and I had hoped to introduce amendments to the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill, but wasn't able to. I do, however, intend to have these considered as part of this bill, but would be happy to work with the Minister on this area. And Sarah Bowick also talked about voter education. I think that's a very important part of all this, making sure that there is the resource in place to ensure that voters are aware of their rights and the information about who they're voting for and the issues of responsibility. Deputy Presiding Officer, within the multitude of provisions, we should also consider the broader importance of this bill, altering as it does the rules about how our democracy functions. It sets the foundations for a number of relatively significant changes to the functioning of our elections, both at Holyrood and local council level. As ever, this places a burden on us to ensure that the structures we put in place are not only fair and credible, but also stable and resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Harker-Johnson. I call on Graham Day to close for the Government. Minister, please, till decision time.
Presiding Officer, thank you. This has been a considered and thoughtful debate, which, despite its short nature, has actually been very useful. And it's certainly memorable personally, not only for the spectacle of Neil Findlay and Adam Tompkins agreeing on a number of matters, but also my concurring with them. It's deeply concerning. The contributions from across the chamber have, I think, highlighted some of the competing views on a number of topics linked to the bill, and I want to focus on those, with apologies to any members whose contributions I don't have time to cover. Adam Tompkins, I would have to say to you, I'm very happy to engage in the same constructive way that he's approached today. He talked about the 5-year term issue and the interaction with UK elections, given the possibility of the Fixed Term Parliament Act being revoked. I mean, there's no easy answer to the question that he posed. I'd simply take the view that I think we should proceed by planning for what we know. At the moment, if we were to take the 5-year term approach, the likelihood is that we would avoid 2 clashes over the next 20 years. It would be the same approach as has been taken in Wales and Northern Ireland, and instinctively I think that is where we should go. With regard to the very valid point he made about the issues around the 2-member ward and wanting to be assured that the use of that provision would be by exception, I absolutely agree with him on that. I'm not sure how you would frame an amendment along the lines that he was talking about, but I'm happy to engage with him on that. But to be absolutely clear, this would be used only in exceptional circumstances. And of course, any proposal would come back to the Parliament for ratification under the affirmative procedure. With regard to e-voting, a number of members rightly highlighted some of the concerns around this. And I would reassure them we are at a very early stage in this. And I entirely recognise the concerns that were expressed, particularly around the integrity of the process. But again, we would be looking at pilot projects. and all of those, before they were taken forward, be subject to scrutiny by this Parliament. So I hope that provides some reassurance for colleagues there. Again, Neil Findlay was very constructive in his contribution. I absolutely recognise this issue about the list order effect and how some members are disadvantaged, or some participants in the election are disadvantaged. And I'm happy to acknowledge the need for further research. And I'm certainly willing to undertake to explore further this issue with the Electoral Commission, because I think it's not something that's going away, and we really do need to find a way forward. But again, find a way forward where we don't simply find ourselves in another situation where someone is disadvantaged in some way. Willie Rennie, like Neil Findlay, explored the issue of full randomisation. And I absolutely get that argument, but I just want to highlight some of the downsides to that without in any way dismissing it as an option. There would be issues for people with certain disabilities who seek to memorise the ballot paper before they go to vote. You will also have to bear in mind that there are a number of individuals, when they go to vote, depend on the enlarged ballot paper in the polling place. We couldn't have that option for them if it was fully randomised. And also, and this may seem a bit spurious, but there is also the matter of a household where multiple ballot papers are sent out through the postal process, and they would be completely different. As I say, I make these points not to in any way dismiss the idea of randomisation, but just to highlight that there are very few alternatives that are absolutely 100% straightforward. Mark Roskell and Sarah Boyack talked about encouraging young people's full participation in this process, and I absolutely agree. Now, obviously, political literacy is embedded in curriculum for excellence, but if I could offer a bit of assurance on this, or reassurance, highlighting my own constituency, where 2 high schools in Angus South have, in the matter of the last few months, either reintroduced or introduced modern studies into the curriculum. And in fact, in one school, they're expanding that into S2 to begin to get young people engaged. So I think the direction of travel there is already positive, but it's an important topic. Mark Roskell and Tom Mason and others talked about the need to review the whole local government electoral system. I have sympathy with that view. I said that at committee. It's been quite a number of years since it was introduced. I think it is perhaps time to have a look at that. But given the parliamentary timetable, I think we'll be into the next Parliament before that's possible. A number of members also highlighted postal ballots as a way forward. I recognise, again, the benefits perhaps in trying pilots, but I do have some reservations around these, which I explained at committee. But again, happy to talk to members moving forward as we go into stage 2 about how we might address the points that they've made. Richard Lyle made a point, sought clarity around the order that I intend to bring in a matter of months to address the issue of the publication of local authority candidates' addresses. Just to offer him assurance that, yes, that will also cover the list of nominated candidates when it's publicly displayed. So I hope that offers him some reassurance. And I commend the work he's done in this area, because it was something that mattered to a number of people, particularly in the circumstances that he noted. Presiding Officer, whilst this bill addresses many facets of electoral law, the central theme is that of putting the interest of the voter first. I'm pleased that it's attracted wide-ranging support from stakeholders and generally in the Chamber today. I hope that members will join me in supporting the principles of the bill, and once again I commit to working constructively with colleagues to make this bill even better. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes our Stage 1 debate on the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. The next item is consideration of motion 20364 on a financial resolution for the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. And could I ask Kate Forbes to move this motion? Moved. Thank you very much. So we're now coming to decision time. The first question is that motion 20740 in the name of Graham Day on the Scottish Elections Reform Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the final question is that motion 20364 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary on a financial resolution for the Scottish Elections Reform Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. That concludes decision time. I close this meeting. Thank you.